It was a warm Sunday in June 2012 when 6-year-old Ellie Morgan walked hand in hand with her father toward the small community playground tucked behind the Oak Hollow Methodist Church. The town had just over 3,000 people, and by all accounts, this was the kind of place where you didn't need to lock your front door. Ellie had just finished her blueberry muffin from the corner bakery. She had on her red sneakers, a white t-shirt with a glittery unicorn, and one pink barrette keeping her bangs from her eyes. Her father, Matthew Morgan, remembers how she skipped ahead of him, asking if she could have just 10 minutes on the swings. He said yes. She let go of his hand and ran ahead. That was the last time anyone saw her alive. There were no other children on the playground at that moment, just a woman pushing a stroller on the sidewalk and an older man walking his dog by the community garden fence. Matthew sat on a bench near the swings. He was going through a pending job application on his phone when it buzzed, a call from his sister who'd just landed at the airport. He stepped away for a moment to hear better, pacing maybe 30 feet toward the tree line for reception. The call lasted 3 minutes. When he returned, the swing was still moving, but Ellie was no longer there. What followed was a moment that every parent fears but can't quite comprehend. Matthew looked around, first slowly, then frantically. He walked the length of the playground, calling her name. He ran to the slide, checked under it, behind the bushes, and then into the small restroom shed. Nothing. No giggle, no footsteps, no response. In under 5 minutes, a child had vanished in daylight, with no scream, no scuffle, and no one noticing. The woman with the stroller told police she hadn't seen anything unusual. She remembered the little girl laughing on the swing, but she'd looked away to check her baby's bottle. When she looked back, the girl was gone, and she assumed the father had taken her. The man walking the dog said he didn't see the girl at all, only the man on the phone. He thought it was odd someone would leave a child unattended, but didn't want to intervene. Matthew called 911 at 11:46 a.m. His voice was shaky, confused. He didn't say the words missing right away. He said, "My daughter was on the swing." I turned around. She's not here. That call triggered what would become one of the largest search efforts in the county's history. Within an hour, police and fire volunteers had roped off the area, and local families had already started combing the nearby woods. The playground was shut down, treated as a potential abduction site. Ellie's mother, Rachel, arrived sobbing 30 minutes later. She'd only gone to get groceries that morning. By early afternoon, K-9 units were brought in from 2 counties over. The dogs picked up Ellie's scent near the swing and followed it briefly toward the wooded trail, before it disappeared completely. No signs of a struggle, no drag marks, no dropped items, no blood, no footprints that weren't accounted for. The bark on the trees was undisturbed. There were no fibers, no hair, and no items left behind, except her sandals, both placed neatly beneath the swing. That detail would haunt investigators for years. It suggested she wasn't taken by force, or if she was, it was by someone she knew and trusted. The press caught wind of the case within 24 hours. The narrative formed quickly. A girl vanished in broad daylight from a town that didn't believe in locking its doors. Some suggested child trafficking. Others blamed the father. Online forums began speculating wildly, pointing fingers at neighbors, teachers, even the church. But within Oak Hollow, the fear was quieter, more personal. Parents stopped letting their children go to the park. Windows stayed shut. Doors were double locked. Everyone began looking sideways at each other. The illusion of safety had ruptured. By the 3rd day, the FBI was assisting. A command center was set up 2 blocks away. A grid search extended out a 2-mile radius. Volunteers walked in staggered lines through brush and creek beds. Drones with thermal imaging swept the forest line. Divers checked the river. Nothing. No witnesses came forward. No ransom note appeared. No traffic cameras captured anything suspicious. It was as if Ellie had evaporated into air. And yet one child, a boy named Jordan, who'd been there earlier that morning, said something that was overlooked at first. He told his mother later that night that he saw a man by the big tree before he left. He said the man had a red cap and kept looking toward the swings. It was a vague statement, easy to dismiss. Jordan had only been 5 years old, but in hindsight, it would become one of the only real leads in the case. By the end of the week, Ellie's photo was on every lamppost, bulletin board, and local news broadcast. The image showed a smiling, gap-toothed little girl with bright brown eyes and mismatched barrettes. Her parents sat beside police at press conferences, begging whoever had her to bring her back. But as the days passed, no answers came. Just a quiet, devastating stillness, the kind of silence that doesn't fill itself. And back at the playground, long after the yellow tape came down, the swing where Ellie had last been seen was still moving slightly, creaking in the summer breeze. Parents began avoiding the park altogether. The grass grew uneven. Weeds climbed the fence, but the swing remained. So did the tree behind it, and for 13 years, that tree would watch everything until one summer storm blew it open. And what was hidden beneath its roots would change everything. By the time the sun had begun to set on that first day, the playground had become a crime scene. Police cordoned off the area with yellow tape, marking the swings, the sand pit, and the shaded trail. Leading into the woods, officers stood in tight huddles speaking in clipped tones, clipboards, flashlights, latex gloves. They marked every inch, every object. Nothing looked out of place, and that was part of the problem. By nightfall, more than 40 people were searching. Neighbors who'd never spoken before walked together, calling Ellie's name through fields and along dirt roads. Flashlights swept through branches. A volunteer tripped over a fence near the creek bed and cut his leg, but didn't stop. They all kept looking. No one thought this could last longer than a few hours. Inside the church across from the playground, volunteers laid out snacks and bottled water on folding tables. Someone printed maps. Someone else brought in a local scout leader to help organize the search routes. Ellie's mother refused to leave the site. She stood near the swings in silence, gripping a small stuffed animal someone had brought from her daughter's bedroom. The wind was still, the air thick. Just after midnight, a K-9 team from 3 towns over arrived. The dog sniffed Ellie's sandals, then pulled sharply toward the tree line. They followed a path to the back of the woods, then lost the scent near an old drainage pipe that led toward the main road. It didn't make sense. No tire tracks, no signs of struggle, just a clean, sudden drop-off. It was like chasing a ghost. By sunrise, news vans were arriving. Helicopters flew overhead. Reporters stood just outside the taped perimeter, whispering into cameras as the story went live. 6-year-old girl vanishes from playground in broad daylight. It didn't take long for the headlines to shift from tragic to terrifying. And for the first time in the town's quiet history, Oak Hollow felt unsafe. The lead detective on the case, David Renner, was a seasoned investigator from the county sheriff's office. He had 3 grown kids and had never lost a child in an active investigation, but he'd seen panic spiral cases out of control before. His first move was to control the narrative. He held a press conference that afternoon. He stood with the mayor and the parents and asked for calm. "We believe Ellie is alive. We believe someone saw something." But by then, fear had already spread. At the elementary school, parents started pulling their kids from class. Some even refused to let their children go to the bathroom alone. Playdates were canceled. The playground at the school was locked. That week, the hardware store sold out of floodlights and door locks. Back at the search grid, volunteers marked trees with colored ribbons to track where they'd already been. The local fire department loaned thermal drones. Creeks were dragged, outbuildings were searched, old cellars were opened. Everything led to the same answer: nothing. One officer suggested checking under crawl spaces of nearby homes. Another insisted on looking in water tanks. They checked sewers, backyards, storage sheds, attics, ditches, and even the church basement. No one said it out loud, but people had begun to fear the worst. Detective Renner began quietly compiling a list of sex offenders within a 50-mile radius. He narrowed in on one who'd been living out of his car just outside town, near a rest stop. The man was picked up, questioned, held for 2 days. But he had a rock-solid alibi. Security footage showed he was in a diner an hour away at the time Ellie vanished. That lid fell apart, just like the rest. The town began to fracture under the weight of helplessness. Rumors bloomed. Some whispered that Ellie's father had been distracted too long, that he must know more than he claimed. Others questioned the mother's stoic behavior on camera. Old feuds between families reignited. A teacher from Ellie's school had to leave town after a viral post falsely accused him of being near the park that day. The accusations were baseless. But once a town turns inward, suspicion doesn't need proof. The FBI was called in on day 3. They conducted interviews, took over evidence management, and reprocessed every detail. The swing was tested for prints, the juice box for DNA. The bark from nearby trees was examined. Nothing foreign was found. Not a hair, not a fiber. No security cameras caught a car leaving the park. No doorbell camera pinged. The timeline was airtight, but it explained nothing. By the 72nd hour, the vigils had begun. First, just a few candles on the sidewalk, then dozens. Teddy bears, crayons, notes in a child's handwriting. One said, "Come home, Ellie, we're waiting." The photo used in the posters showed her smiling in front of a birthday cake. People started calling her the girl with the unicorn shirt. Her face was now on TV, in the paper, and on the pinned board of every gas station within 3 counties. But behind the scenes, something else had shifted. Hope had started to shrink. The officers stopped using the word rescue. The cadaver dogs were called again, this time to search for something different. And the press began referring to it not as a disappearance, but as a case. Still, no one wanted to say it. Not yet. Not to her parents. Not to each other. Because how could a child simply vanish in the middle of the day, in a park surrounded by houses with no one noticing? That question would hang over Oak Hollow for years to come. But in the days that followed, it paralyzed everything. Schools cut recess time, parents walked their children to class, neighborhood watch groups formed, porch lights stayed on all night, and just beyond the playground, beneath the tree that had stood for nearly 50 years, the grass was starting to thin. Its roots stretched wide underground, deeper than anyone imagined, and they were hiding something no one thought to check. Not yet. By the 3rd day, the search had shifted from hope to evidence. Not that there was much. The first things detectives zeroed in on were the ones that seemed too clean to make sense. Ellie's sandals, red, size 11 toddler, placed directly beneath the swing, not kicked off in a rush or yanked away. They were side by side, aligned, the straps unbuckled, like someone had helped her out of them, or she'd stepped out of them herself. The impression they left in the sand was faint by the time crime scene techs got there, but visible enough to photograph. There were no other prints nearby that weren't accounted for. Beside the swing, tucked slightly in the grass, was a half-empty juice box. Apple flavor, identical to the one Rachel Morgan packed that morning. DNA later confirmed it belonged to Ellie. The straw had been bitten flat near the top, a tiny fingerprint on the side, smudged, not usable. But it was hers. That detail gave her mother a strange sort of comfort for a time. Proof, she said, that Ellie had still been smiling before whatever happened. She drank the juice. She sat on the swing. And then, something shifted. Detectives canvassed the area thoroughly. Nearby houses were questioned. Car windows were knocked on. Garbage bins were searched. One thing that stood out early was a small drawing found on the sidewalk between the church and the garden fence. It was done in pink chalk. A figure, maybe a girl, holding hands with a taller figure next to a tree. No one could say for sure if it was Ellie's drawing. Her teacher said she drew like that often, but it was too vague to mean anything. It was photographed, bagged, and eventually filed away. The most ambiguous clue came from a 5-year-old boy named Jordan, who had been at the playground with his grandmother earlier that morning. They'd left just after 11. At first, his statement didn't seem to offer much, but when re-interviewed, he told officers he remembered seeing a man standing by the big tree. He said the man had a red hat and looked like a worker. He couldn't describe the man's face, only that he had dirty pants and was watching the swings. Jordan wasn't considered a reliable witness at the time. Too young, too vague. But later, his words would haunt the case file. The big tree Jordan referenced stood just 15 feet from the swing set. A large elm, its roots pushed up slightly in spots. It was older than the playground itself. Its trunk had been carved over the years, initials, hearts, kids' names. On that day, nothing about it stood out to investigators. There were no obvious drag marks in the soil, no broken branches, no blood, no signs of recent disturbance. But there was one thing that raised questions: a narrow gap between the tree's roots and the chain-link fence behind it, just wide enough for a small child to squeeze through. It led toward the rear utility alley and eventually opened to a quiet side road. If Ellie had run or been led that way, she could have been out of sight within seconds. The problem was, there were no footprints, no tire, marks, no threads of clothing, nothing indicating anyone had passed through recently. The soil was dry. The alley was gravel. The houses along the fence had no security cameras, and the church's camera had been broken for months. There was no surveillance footage, no eyewitnesses, just a quiet gap in the back fence that led nowhere. Investigators checked for sex offenders again, this time expanding the search to include day laborers, groundskeepers, and seasonal workers who had logged jobs in the area. A few names came up: a janitor who'd once worked at the church, a landscaper who maintained the nearby lots. But each was accounted for. One was out of state, one had been hospitalized. The leads didn't hold. They brought in a profiler by day 5. His assessment was cautious. If Ellie had known her abductor, it might explain the lack of struggle. But if it had been a stranger, the placement of the sandals suggested a level of psychological manipulation, someone who was calm, patient, and possibly rehearsed. The profiler emphasized this was likely not their first time watching children, but without evidence, it was guesswork. Ellie's family did their own searching. Rachel refused to go home. She stayed at the church most nights, sleeping on a cot behind the chapel with a blanket from Ellie's room. Matthew walked the town endlessly. He stopped people, rechecked places police had already been. He said he kept expecting to see her face in a crowd, like she'd just gotten lost and didn't know how to call for help. Grief made them restless. Hope made them desperate. By day 6, detectives revisited the swing. They looked again at the sandals, the juice box. They tried to reconstruct the timeline to the second. The gap between when Ellie was last seen swinging and when Matthew returned was roughly 3 minutes and 24 seconds. That window became everything. And it wasn't enough. A press conference on the 7th day brought no new developments. Reporters asked about the stranger by the tree. Detective Renner said they had no confirmed suspect. The leads had dried up. The scent trail had ended. The town was exhausted. Ellie's name was still on everyone's lips, but for the first time, people began to speak about her in the past tense. And that's when the case took its first real pause. No movement, no evidence, no sightings. The investigation slowed. The swing remained taped off, but the officers began rotating out. Other calls took priority, and for the first time since June 10th, the playground fell quiet. But the man by the tree? He was never identified, and the old elm remained rooted in place, solid, still, and untouched. For now. By the end of the second week, the command center was taken down. The yellow tape at the playground had loosened in the rain and was finally removed. Search teams were no longer arriving daily, and the lines of volunteers had thinned. But investigators continued working. Just differently. With no physical evidence and no confirmed sightings, they started expanding the radius. The phrase they used in the reports was simple but final. No longer a local containment. The original 2-mile search zone stretched to 5, then 10. Waterways were dragged again. A landfill was checked. Utility covers were opened. Drainage ditches were flushed. Still, nothing. In July, a state task force began revisiting every known offender in a 50-mile range. 17 names were pulled. Only one had a record involving children, a 41-year-old who lived in a camper on the outskirts of a nearby town. He'd been off the grid for 2 weeks around the time Ellie disappeared. That was enough to get him brought in. The interrogation lasted 8 hours. He denied everything, said he'd been in Michigan with his brother. It checked out. Cell tower pings backed it up. No connection to Ellie, no link to the park, no red hat. After that, his name was cleared. But the damage was done. Flyers with his face had already circulated online. He would later file a defamation suit. A second lead came in August. A truck stop security guard reported seeing a girl matching Ellie's description getting into an RV with an older man. The RV had out-of-state plates. The story hit local media fast. Her mother flew out the next morning. Investigators obtained footage, zoomed in, enhanced it. The girl was older, at least 10. Not Ellie. Just another false hope, another pitfall in the process. And there would be more. One tip came from a woman convinced Ellie had been taken by a religious group she claimed was operating in the area. She brought photos, maps, even a hand-drawn diagram of tunnels. Detectives listened, took notes, and politely filed it away under fringe. By late summer, they'd received over 600 tips. Not one led anywhere real. Back in Oak Hollow, time had slowed. The town looked the same, but the mood had changed. The playground reopened quietly. The swing Ellie had used was replaced, but parents avoided the area. Kids were kept close. Conversations grew shorter. No one knew what to say anymore. It wasn't that they'd forgotten. It was that no one knew how to keep hoping out loud. At home, the Morgans were unraveling. Rachel stopped sleeping in her bed. She spent most nights in Ellie's room, curled up next to her stuffed animals, replaying voicemail recordings, rereading text messages, convincing herself that somewhere in those final mornings she had missed something. A pattern, a feeling, a warning, something. Matthew, on the other hand, grew quiet. Too quiet. He stopped answering phone calls, stopped returning messages from the detective. He went back to work briefly in August, but left mid-shift after breaking down in the locker room. By fall, he'd moved out of the house entirely. Not out of anger, but detachment. He later told a family friend that every wall in the house whispered Ellie's name, and he couldn't take it anymore. The two parents would grow apart in their grief. Rachel became more visible, speaking at vigils, appearing in local interviews, keeping Ellie's photo in circulation. She created a Facebook page dedicated to updates and awareness. It gained followers quickly. Strangers sent messages, some offered tips, others just shared prayers. One message from a woman in Missouri simply read, "I lost my son too. You are not alone." Rachel saved that one. Detective Renner remained on the case, but resources thinned. Other crimes demanded attention. There was no sign of life, no body, and no new suspect. By September, he began consulting with national experts, forensic analysts, behavioral psychologists, cold case specialists. He had a room in the back of his office where the case files were laid out, printed photos clipped to a corkboard, maps, timelines, a photograph of the tree. That tree became symbolic. To some, it was just a tree. To Rachel, it was the last thing that touched her daughter's shadow. She started visiting it every week, laying flowers at its roots. Neighbors grew used to the sight of her parked car near the chain-link fence. Sometimes she'd bring a candle. Sometimes she'd bring Ellie's favorite snack, banana chips in a small plastic bowl. She would sit there quietly for an hour, then drive away. In November, the woods behind the playground were searched again, this time with ground-penetrating radar and sonar. It took 2 days, nothing was found. The soil was hard, undisturbed, no cavities, no hidden chambers. The equipment showed normal tree root patterns, no anomalies. The results were conclusive. There was nothing back there. But Rachel wasn't convinced. She started requesting old property records, blueprints of the original park. She told the lead investigator she didn't believe Ellie had left the park. Not really. Something inside her refused to accept the idea that Ellie had been taken away. She believed her daughter was still close, just not found. The holidays passed in silence. A candle was left burning in the window on Christmas Eve. Ellie's stocking was hung. Her room was untouched. On New Year's Day, Rachel updated the Facebook page again. A single post. "She's still 6 to me." 6 months had passed since Ellie Morgan vanished. The swing had stopped creaking. The ribbons on the trees had faded. The flyers had curled in the sun. The public attention was quieter now, but the grief hadn't moved. It had just learned how to live without making noise. And beneath the old elm tree, roots continued to spread, inch by inch, silently weaving through the earth, still holding something, still untouched. The years that followed didn't come all at once. They came slowly, season by season. First summer turned to fall, then winter. Then Ellie's 7th birthday came and went with no answers. By the second year, the flyers were gone from storefronts, the phone. Lines at the tip center stopped ringing, and the search dogs were no longer called in. But the swing still stood. The playground was renovated in 2015. New slides, new mulch, fresh benches. The town approved it quietly, without ceremony. No one wanted to admit it out loud, but people had stopped bringing their children there. The updates were a way of making the space usable again, trying to wipe away what had happened. But one thing wasn't replaced. The swing Ellie had vanished from. It stayed. Its chains had been tightened, the plastic seat had faded in the sun, but it remained, creaking when the wind came through. Like it had more to say. Back at home, Rachel Morgan kept Ellie's bedroom exactly as it was. The sheets were never changed. Her drawings still lined the walls. A half-finished art project with glitter glue sat on the desk, untouched. Rachel said she needed to leave it that way, not as a shrine, but as a kind of placeholder, in case Ellie came back and needed everything to be the same. She never gave up the case. When the police slowed their updates, Rachel started a website, a digital archive of every known detail. She uploaded timelines, case files, press conference footage, and her own theories. She responded to every email. She chased every new tip. And when that wasn't enough, she started a podcast, Missing from Oak Hollow. It wasn't just about Ellie. She featured other missing persons cases too, but Ellie was always at the center. Over time, a community formed around her. Other parents of missing children, true crime followers, amateur sleuths. The podcast didn't go viral, but it found loyal listeners, people who left comments, people who cared. They started calling Rachel the voice that doesn't blink. She never cried on the mic. She only asked questions and waited. Each year on June 10th, Rachel organized a candlelight vigil beneath the tree, the same elm that had stood beside the swing all those years ago. She brought a table, photos, a handwritten sign, "One day closer." Locals came at first, then fewer, then mostly strangers, listeners from the podcast, people who had driven for hours just to stand with her. Some brought flowers, others brought missing posters of their own loved ones. They'd read names out loud, they'd light candles, and then they'd go home. The rumors never stopped. They just changed shape. Some said Ellie had been abducted by a cult operating along the river basin, a theory that spread after 2 other children went missing in neighboring states years later. Others insisted the case matched trafficking patterns seen across southern routes. There were even rumors that Ellie had been spotted in Mexico, then later in Canada. Every time a story surfaced, Rachel would chase it. Every time it would fall apart. Local law enforcement continued to classify the case as open but inactive. Leads were revisited when new tools became available. Updated DNA, databases, forensic genealogy, artificial aging software. None of it led anywhere. By Ellie's 10th birthday, the FBI had shifted their resources elsewhere. By her 12th, the case was formally moved to the cold case unit. Rachel wasn't informed directly. She found out from a journalist. Some in Oak Hollow began to move on in different ways. A few blamed the parents, not openly, but in whispers. Old classmates who had known Ellie briefly began to forget her face. A few people even said it was time to stop the vigils. One woman posted on Facebook that Rachel was keeping the town in a place it didn't want to live anymore. Rachel didn't respond. Matthew Morgan had long since moved away. He remarried quietly in 2019 and had another child. He no longer did interviews. He didn't attend the vigils. When asked once if he still believed Ellie was alive, he paused, then said, "I believe something happened that none of us are ready to face." He never explained what he meant. On Ellie's 13th birthday, Rachel brought 13 white candles and placed them at the base of the tree. She played a voicemail Ellie had once left, her tiny voice saying, "Hi, Mommy. I love you. I miss you. I made a picture." She played it twice. Then she sat in silence for an hour. Just her and the tree. No crowd that year, no press, just the sound of distant traffic and wind moving across the grass. Later that night, she updated the podcast feed with a message, not an episode, just her voice. 13 years and I still believe she's near. Someone knows something. Maybe they pass this tree every day. Maybe they hear the wind and wonder if it's time to speak. Maybe they're waiting for something to break, and then the feed cut off. What Rachel didn't know, what no one knew, was that within weeks, a violent storm would roll through Oak Hollow. A storm strong enough to knock down the elm tree beside the playground. And when that tree fell, what was buried beneath it would finally be revealed. On June 29th, 2025, just after 2 a.m., a thunderstorm swept across Oak Hollow. The wind pushed through the valley with a force locals said they hadn't seen in years. Power lines went down, backyards flooded, a few barns took damage. But in the middle of town, it was something quieter that changed everything. The old elm tree behind the playground, the one that had stood near the swing set for over 5 decades, finally came down. It split at the base and toppled toward the fence line, flattening part of the garden beds behind the church and snapping 2 benches in half. No one was hurt, no alarms were raised. But the next morning, when cleanup crews arrived, one of the workers noticed something buried beneath the roots. At first glance, it looked like nothing. A dark hole, maybe where the trunk had begun to rot from the inside. But as they cleared debris, they uncovered a cavity, roughly 2 feet wide, 2 feet deep, packed with loose soil. It wasn't a natural root formation. It looked dug. Inside was a rusted, dented metal container, a lunchbox sealed with an old leather strap. One of the workers radioed the site manager, who notified the police. Officers were on the scene within the hour. The box was removed carefully. It weighed less than 2 pounds, no lock, no visible markings at first. But once it was cleaned and pried open, the contents stopped everyone cold. Inside were children's items, small, ordinary things, but unmistakably intimate. A purple eraser shaped like a dolphin, a worn cloth headband, a beaded bracelet missing 2 beads, a faded sticker sheet with cartoon animals. And at the bottom, stuck to the inside lid, was a name label, slightly water-damaged but legible. It read, Ellie Morgan. The officers backed away. The area was immediately reclassified as a crime scene. Evidence tents went up. The dirt surrounding the cavity was sifted by hand. The roots were photographed, sectioned, cataloged. A forensic team from the state was called in to oversee the excavation. The entire base of the tree was slowly peeled back. Beneath the main cavity, deeper in the soil, they found something else. It was a button. Plastic, pink, partially cracked, with a cartoon unicorn in the center. It matched the buttons on the shirt Ellie had worn the day she disappeared. Nearby, buried in compacted soil, were fragments of synthetic fabric, later confirmed to be polyester blend, consistent with children's clothing from the same time period. And then, scattered throughout the lower root system, they began uncovering bone. At first, just small pieces, a rib, a portion of a scapula, then a fragment of mandible. The remains were badly degraded, but not entirely gone. They were human, child-sized, and dental comparison with Ellie's medical records would confirm what her mother had known the moment she heard about the lunchbox. 13 years after Ellie Morgan vanished from the swing set, she had been found. Not in another town, not across state lines, not in someone's basement, but underneath the tree that stood just feet from where she'd last been seen. The tree Rachel had sat beneath for hours, the one she'd brought candles to, the one police had walked past, searched behind, tested with sonar. It had been holding the truth the entire time. What stunned investigators wasn't just the location, it was the condition of the hiding place. Forensic analysis revealed the cavity wasn't naturally occurring. Someone had dug it out deliberately, likely with hand tools, and lined the interior with old boards and burlap sacks to hold its shape. It was small, cramped, and sealed in a way that let the tree's roots grow around it, covering the space entirely over the years. Whoever had built it knew how to make it disappear. That discovery sent shockwaves through the community. For days, the playground was surrounded by media trucks. National outlets picked up the story. Online forums lit up again. People wanted to know who had done this, how it had been missed, and most haunting of all, had Ellie died there or been placed there after the fact? The medical examiner's report would offer some answers, but not all. The cause of death couldn't be definitively determined due to the condition of the remains. No trauma to the skull, no knife marks, no bullet wounds. But the position of the body, the location, and the contents of the lunchbox suggested that Ellie had been placed in the cavity within hours, maybe even minutes, of her disappearance. Experts believed she had not been moved multiple times. She had been hidden, then sealed in. What that meant was simple. She had never left the park. Detectives went back through every piece of original evidence, every interview, every officer log, every overlooked witness. The boy who mentioned seeing a man by the tree, suddenly, his words took on new weight. They searched for records of maintenance workers, janitors, groundskeepers who had access to the property in 2012. One name came up. A part-time church custodian with a history of mental illness and inappropriate behavior around children. He had died in 2019. No DNA had ever been taken. No red flags had been strong enough to hold him. For Rachel, the revelation was devastating, not because it answered the question, but because of where it had been all along. She later said, "I sat with my back to that tree for years. I used to talk to her from that spot, and she was there. She was right there." The search was over, but the silence it left behind was worse. Because now, the question wasn't where Ellie had gone. It was how so many people had looked past her. When the DNA results came back, there was no doubt left. The bone fragments found beneath the tree belonged to Ellie Morgan. A partial match was confirmed within 48 hours. The mitochondrial DNA was consistent with Rachel's. A week later, dental records would seal the case. After 13 years of searching, Ellie had been found. But instead of relief, the discovery opened a door no one was prepared to walk through. The forensics team began re-excavating the area around the base of the tree. This time, every inch was cataloged under strict protocol. The roots were photographed, sliced, and removed in layers. The soil was sifted inch by inch. What they were looking for was context, not just proof of death, but the truth of what had happened inside that cavity. Near the original lunchbox, they recovered additional items. A single pink plastic barrette, faded but intact. It was identical to the one Ellie had been wearing on the day she vanished, according to school photos and her mother's description. The clasp still worked. It was found resting against a small cluster of bone, vertebrae, likely cervical. Close by, a plastic button surfaced, cartoon design, partially rubbed away. It matched a unicorn shirt. Further down, wrapped in degraded burlap fibers, was a tiny cloth pouch, its drawstring knotted tight. Inside were 3 marbles and a miniature rubber duck. Ellie's mother recognized every object. She had packed them in Ellie's bag that week, part of a calm-down kit recommended by her therapist. Rachel had worried about her daughter's recent fears, loud noises, being alone, unfamiliar faces. The pouch was supposed to help her self-soothe when she felt overwhelmed. It was meant to make her feel safe. Instead, it had been buried with her. The condition of the cavity was now the main focus. It wasn't a shallow grave. It had been designed. The opening beneath the tree had a makeshift wall built from rotted plywood and lined with old towels, plastic sheeting, and even pieces of cardboard insulation. It had been dug out by hand. No machinery. Just someone who knew how to work quietly and quickly. Investigators estimated the space could only fit a child Ellie's size, not standing, not kneeling. Curled. It changed everything. Because if Ellie had been buried, the expectation would have been vertical layering, depth, decomposition over time. But this wasn't burial. This was concealment. Someone had gone to extreme lengths not just to hide a body, but to preserve the illusion that she'd never been there. The discovery reignited the investigation overnight. Cold case files were reopened, evidence logs were rescanned, a command post was reestablished 2 blocks from the park, and this time, detectives were looking not just for a killer, but for a builder, someone with access, someone who had been comfortable enough at that playground to dig a hiding place in the open, likely before the day Ellie disappeared. They turned to maintenance records, groundskeepers, church staff, contractors who had worked near the park in the years before 2012. One name came up repeatedly in old logs. Charles Emery, age 58 in 2012, worked part-time as a church custodian. Quiet, lived alone, no criminal record, no family in town. He had died in 2019 from liver failure. At the time, there had been no reason to look into him, but now, everything about his file seemed off. He'd worked for the church off and on for years, knew the layout, had keys, had once helped dig out a drainage channel after flooding. The timing matched. His last shift before Ellie's disappearance had been the Saturday before. He hadn't shown up that Monday. The following week, he quit without explanation. No one followed up. Detectives visited the address he had listed at the time, a rental duplex 5 miles from the park. The current tenants didn't know him. But in the crawl space beneath the house, tucked behind an old fuse box, they found a warped wooden box containing dozens of loose pages, sketches, diagrams, notes, even a hand-drawn ledger. Among the items listed were things like wire mesh, glue traps, storage, ties, and one entry simply labeled Tree 7B. They took it all in. Forensic handwriting analysis confirmed it was Charles's handwriting. Soil samples on the box matched the composition under the playground tree. A microscopic trace of the same insulation found in the cavity appeared inside the box's interior lid. It wasn't direct evidence of murder, but it was the first true connection to a suspect. The term used in the case report was intentional concealment structure. Investigators now believed the cavity had been constructed weeks, maybe even months before Ellie vanished, and whoever built it had likely observed children at that playground regularly, rehearsed the timing, knew when the park was empty, when the parents were distracted, how long it took to disappear behind the tree. What remained unclear, and would likely never be known, was what had happened once Ellie entered that space. Had she been taken there alive? Had she been lured? Was she trapped and left? The autopsy couldn't tell them. There were no visible signs of trauma. The working theory was positional asphyxia, a confined space, a panicked child, no air, no sound. Rachel never commented publicly on the name Charles Emery, not once. When asked in an interview if she wanted the man blamed, she simply said, "I want her to be seen now. I want people to know she was never lost. She was there. She was always there." And in the weeks that followed, as the last of the tree was removed, a sign was installed in the grass just behind the swing set. It read, "In memory of Ellie Morgan." Let no child vanish unheard, but this case still wasn't over, because one final piece of Charles Emery's ledger hadn't been decoded, and it pointed to something else. 13 years after Ellie Morgan vanished from a swing set in Oak Hollow, and months after her remains were discovered beneath the roots of a tree, investigators returned to something they had overlooked: a witness, or rather, the only child who had seen anything at all. His name was Jordan Wells, 5 years old at the time of Ellie's disappearance, now 18 and living 2 towns away. He had only been at the park that morning for 20 minutes, swinging beside Ellie while his grandmother sat on a bench reading the local paper. He had told officers, both then and later, that he remembered seeing a man standing by the big tree, a man in a red hat, dirty pants, watching. Back then, it hadn't been enough to act on. The description was too vague, and Jordan was considered too young to be reliable. But in 2025, that changed. Now that Ellie had been found beneath that very tree, what the boy had seen was no longer a curiosity. It was likely the last living clue. Detectives contacted him quietly. He didn't resist. He remembered the park, remembered the swing, remembered Ellie vaguely, not from school, but from that morning. He still saw her face sometimes. he said, the way she smiled at her shoes before she started swinging. But the man, that image was harder. He'd seen him in his periphery, standing by the trunk near the back fence. He hadn't been close, but he hadn't looked like a parent. This time, the approach was different. They didn't ask for a sketch. They brought in a trauma psychologist, someone who specialized in forensic memory recovery. The technique wasn't hypnosis in the theatrical sense, it was controlled recall, memory reinforcement through guided narrative and environmental detail. Jordan agreed. The sessions took place over 2 weeks. In the beginning, he could only remember pieces, a hat, a walk, someone standing still. But then came something new. On the 3rd session, Jordan remembered the man's shoes, thick, black with a long toe, not sneakers, work shoes, and the smell, bleach or something sharp like it, and something else, a key ring that jingled when he walked. By session 5, Jordan began to shake. He said the man wasn't a stranger. He'd seen him before, not at the park, at the school, cleaning the hallway. Investigators brought out old employment records. The elementary school kept archives. There were a handful of janitors who had worked part-time in the spring of 2012. One of the names stopped the room. Charles Emery. The same man whose handwriting had been found in a wooden box beneath his old rental. The same man listed as part-time maintenance staff at the church where the playground stood. He had worked at the school only briefly, for 3 weeks in April 2012, then again as a substitute groundskeeper that summer. The records didn't even show his termination, just that he ceased activity. The connection was immediate. Charles had access to both properties, knew the layout, had reason to be near the playground, and now an eyewitness, even a delayed one, had placed him there. The timeline began to tighten. The next step was a warrant. Charles had died in 2019, but his property, what was left of it, had been placed in a long-term storage unit just outside Fairview. A climate-controlled facility, low rent, automatic payments. It had never been cleared out. Investigators obtained the warrant on a Monday. By Wednesday, they were inside. The unit was small, dusty, unlit, but the items inside were carefully arranged, not boxed, not discarded, displayed, stacks of notebooks, crates of old tools, broken clocks, rolls of wire, and on the far wall, propped against a wooden beam, was a corkboard. It had been covered in a sheet now yellowed. When they removed it, what they saw stopped them cold. There were sketches, dozens of them, hand-drawn diagrams of the playground, not just general layouts, detailed ones, arrows, timing loops, numbered paths, labels like Routine A, Blind Spot, and Peak Hours. Some were annotated with scribbled thoughts. 3 minutes max, kids alone often. Midday ideal. In the lower right corner of the board was a laminated map, a printed satellite image of the park dated April 2012. A red dot had been drawn just beneath the tree. Next to it, a single word, chamber. The board was removed, cataloged. Every notebook was taken into evidence. Back at the lab, forensic analysts found multiple references in the margins to what Charles called the hide. There were lists of materials used: tarp, paneling, soft sealant, concrete dust. He referred to the space like it was a project, not as a place to bury, but as a place to observe. Silent, sealed, safe. That phrase appeared 6 times. Even more disturbing were the crude illustrations. Stick figures, children on swings, paths to the tree. One drawing showed a figure with a lunchbox walking behind another smaller figure. The caption beneath read, "Walk doesn't notice." It wasn't clear what that meant, but the implication was chilling. Investigators now had not just circumstantial evidence, but context. Charles had planned something, built something, watched for months, maybe years. The cavity beneath the tree wasn't a moment of panic. It was preparation. It had been waiting. Back at the department, Jordan was informed gently. He was shown one sketch, just the outline. He said the nose looked right, the posture, and he pointed to a small rectangle near the figure's hand. "That's the key ring," he said. "That's what I heard." But there was one more thing. In a folder beneath the corkboard, detectives found a sheet labeled Hold List. It wasn't clear what that meant, but it listed 5 locations, marked only by initials and street codes. G.H. Westwalk Lot, T.S. Farm Ridge. One of them read simply EM-Tree 7B. They knew what that one was. The others were sent to field units. Farm Ridge led nowhere, a vacant lot. Westwalk Lot revealed discarded tools and nails, but nothing relevant. But the last entry, one that read BG, Bridgewell South, raised eyebrows. Bridgewell South had been the site of another missing persons case. A girl named Brianna Gale disappeared in 2008 while walking to school. Never found. Her case had gone cold for over a decade. Now it was reclassified. Investigators started mapping Charles Emery's movement between 2005 and 2012. A pattern began to emerge, not proof, but proximity. 4 disappearances within regions where Charles had either worked, lived, or had known access. None ever proven, none even connected until now. For Ellie's case, the state considered it closed. Charles Emery was named the sole person of interest with posthumous suspicion. But Rachel refused to call it closure. She didn't want a name. She wanted a truth that could answer the question no one had yet explained. Why build a hiding place for a child you didn't plan to keep? Detectives speculated quietly. Some believed it was part of a larger sickness, not just the act, but the control. That the real goal wasn't murder, but containment. Others believed it was panic, a plan gone wrong. Ellie may have cried, suffocated, died unintentionally. And rather than face exposure, Charles had sealed the site and walked away. But no one could say for sure. Back at the playground, the new sign beneath the tree now carried another plaque, this one with Rachel's words engraved below. I asked them to check the tree. They said they did. I asked them again. They didn't. And Jordan, now 18, the last child who saw Ellie alive, gave one interview. He didn't say much, just that he remembered the man by the tree, and that he wished he'd told someone sooner. In the final report, the detective's closing line was blunt. He built a chamber to watch the swing. He didn't need a reason. But there was one question left behind. If Charles Emery had planned for Ellie, what were the other dots on the map? And how many more chambers had he left behind? The structure beneath the tree wasn't a grave. It wasn't shallow or random. It had been built, hidden between the roots and the fence line, shielded from view by thick soil and time. It had walls, crude ones, constructed from broken pallets and insulation foam, carefully wedged between the natural contours of the tree's base. What the storm had exposed wasn't just an accident of nature. It was a chamber, a hiding place, a trap. Forensic architects studied the shape and size. They determined it was likely constructed in stages with deliberate design. The ventilation system, though makeshift, had intention. Plastic tubing coiled through cracks in the roots, covered with debris to obscure airflow. The floor was packed with soil, layered with fabric, towels likely stolen. There were signs of prior entry, compressed areas where someone may have crawled in. The dimensions matched Ellie's size exactly. Investigators believe she was led or chased into the space. The most plausible theory is that she was coaxed, tricked, maybe offered something familiar, and made to enter willingly. There was no sign of restraint, no fibers, no rope, no tape, just the space, and the silence that followed. Based on decomposition patterns and the limited presence of remains, Ellie likely didn't survive more than a few hours. The cavity, while ventilated, wasn't truly breathable. In hot weather, the air would have turned thin. If she cried out, the insulation would have muffled it. If she panicked, there was no light, no way out. There were scratches along the wood panels, some shallow, others deeper. Her fingernails were never recovered. A forensic entomologist confirmed the timeline. Insects found within the cavity aligned with a summer 2012 death window. Nothing inconsistent, no secondary contamination, no relocation. Ellie had died inside the structure, and she had remained there, undisturbed, for over a decade. The most chilling detail wasn't the construction itself, it was the proximity. The entrance was no more than 20 feet from where volunteers had walked. The chamber sat directly beneath a section of the tree that searchers had leaned against while organizing the early search grids. When cadaver dogs passed over it, the scent was either too deep, too fresh, or too well sealed to detect, or maybe it had been missed. There's no definitive answer. Charles Emery's design had worked. He hadn't needed to take Ellie far. He hadn't needed a vehicle, a weapon, or a second location. He only needed time. 3 minutes, the same window when her father stepped away to take a call, and a space he'd already prepared. When investigators cross-referenced his presence near the park, a new theory formed. He'd been watching for weeks, maybe months, patterns, routines, parental habits. Detectives found notes in his old notebooks referring to specific days, clothing descriptions, and weather conditions. One page simply said, "Rain means no go. Sun means less attention." Another, "Unicorn Day." Yes, that was the shirt Ellie had worn on the day she disappeared. Whether Charles had intended to kill Ellie is still debated. Some believed the chamber was part of a larger ritual, not satanic or symbolic, but psychological. A private fantasy constructed into a physical space, an environment where he controlled every variable. Others believed Ellie was never supposed to survive, that the trap was always a tomb. What's known for certain is this: she was alive when she entered, and she was alone when she died. Rachel was briefed in private. The forensic team explained everything: the air quality, the space, the depth, the time window. She sat through it all without speaking. When asked if she wanted to see the location, she said no. Later that night, she left a single candle at the base of the new tree planted in Ellie's name. She didn't light it. Ellie's father didn't attend the site visit. He issued a written statement instead. It read, in part, "I was 28 when I lost her. I'm 41 now. That tree got to stand beside her longer than I did." Back at the crime lab, technicians reassembled a digital model of the structure. They used drone footage from the post-storm collapse, layered with the physical measurements and root growth patterns. The final render showed a space barely tall enough for a 6-year-old to sit up, with no light source, no exits, no water. A trap door hidden by a root cluster had been the only entrance. The door was warped shut from moisture by the time the tree came down. No one could say how long it had stayed sealed, but based on tree ring growth, it hadn't shifted since 2013. There was no evidence of a second victim, no signs the chamber had been used again, no additional DNA. But the journals found in Charles Emery's storage unit hinted at further planning. Multiple locations, trial sites, as he called them. One was marked decommissioned, 2 were illegible. Only Tree 7B had been marked as completed. The FBI began canvassing other towns, linking cold cases by geography, construction supply purchases, and timelines. But nothing definitive connected Charles to another victim. Ellie remained the only known case. The town of Oak Hollow has since installed a new playground, smaller, more open. The swing set was removed entirely. In its place stands a memorial bench with Ellie's name etched in steel. Below it, a plaque reads, "She was never missing. She was hidden." The story has since appeared on national broadcasts, podcasts, and documentary specials. But within Oak Hollow, the case remains personal. A tragedy not about monsters in the dark, but about the ones who learn how to hide in daylight. And beneath the tree they walked past for years, in a space no one ever thought to open, Ellie waited. And now there was one question left. Why build a place for a child if you never meant for her to leave? The town didn't hold a press conference. There were no parades, no vigils this time. Just a quiet silence that seemed to stretch over everything. The case was officially closed, and Ellie Morgan's name was no longer at the top of any active list. But what remained was harder to categorize, because what they'd found, and where they'd found it, left more than grief. It left shame. For 13 years, everyone had looked outward, toward highways, forests, dark vans, strange men. They'd searched rivers, basements, barns. They'd blamed each other. rumored the parents, questioned the town. But the truth had been sitting in plain view, wrapped in tree roots, barely 20 feet from the swing set. She hadn't disappeared into the unknown. She had been placed into silence, then forgotten. Rachel Morgan never held a memorial. She didn't order a headstone. She refused to bury the remains. In her final interview, standing beside the crater where the elm once stood, she said she wasn't ready. Her voice was low, strained. Her eyes didn't blink. "I always told them to check the tree," she said. "I begged them." I stood right here and begged. There was no anger left in her voice, just a kind of exhaustion that didn't sound like the end of a story. It sounded like the end of a question. People in town walked differently now near the playground, slower, quieter. Some still avoid it entirely. Others leave toys near the new bench or tuck flowers into the chain-link fence that remains. No one says Ellie's name much anymore, but no one forgets. Because the most haunting part of her story wasn't that she was taken. It was how close she had always been. Right there, underneath them, all along.